Alright, got a piece of beeswing eucalyptus veneer on a MDF substrate. Got 5 coats of water-based polyurethane. I sanded between each coat with 320 grit sandpaper. You can see I've got some air bubbles that came through the surface. Here is a dry spot. I didn't sufficiently get my last coat covered. I will touch that up with a little bit of top coat. I'll show you how I do that. And you'll also notice some brush strokes which are still evident. Those brush strokes and air bubbles will disappear when I start to flatten and polish the surface. Alright, I'm going to get rid of this little dry spot here. I'm going to scuff it with a little bit of 400 grit. Just enough to ensure my little touch-up patch has a little tooth to bite into the underlying finish. So you can see where I just scuffed that surface. Now I'll come back in with a little bit of top coat to patch it and let that dry, and then I will go ahead and flatten the entire piece. So you can see the scuff marks from the little bit of a braiding I did. So I'll just take a touch-up brush and go over the spot. Just make sure I even out the brush strokes as best I can. And that looks good. I'll add just a little bit more finish where that low spot is. That should be sufficient to build up to the existing surface level. I'll let this dry for 24 hours. I'll come back tomorrow and start to polish this thing up. Materials that I'll use to flatten the finish. By any automotive paint store, auto parts store would probably have these items if Home Depot does not. It's wet dry sandpaper. I'm going to start at 400, work up to 1500. I will use water as my lubricant. Now you can use mineral spirits, you can use soap and water, you can use mineral oil. They all have their drawbacks and their benefits. I'll post that. And I also want a very flexible yet flat sanding tool. So I've created this little block with cork on one side and some neoprene from a wetsuit on the other side. This will give me a firm but even pressure on my abrasive paper. The flexibility just releases a little bit of the pressure when you're pushing on the wood. Helps to reduce corning, which is basically the balling up of the finish, and it also sort of mitigates any high spots, allows you to attack those a little bit more gently. I've waited 24 hours since I repaired this low spot over here. Should be plenty dry. And so now what I'm going to do is to sand everything smooth, get rid of brush strokes, flaws, etc. And I'll be starting out with 400 grit sandpaper using water as a lubricant. Like I said, you could add soap and water. Adding soap takes a little bit longer, but it will make sanding smoother and flow a little easier. With just the water, it gets a little sticky and it's more aggressive. I think when I finish up my sanding, when I get up to the higher grits, I will put a little bit of soap into the water. This little rag. Get my surface wet. And again, the purpose of the lubrication is to prevent corning. So corning is basically material from the finish that balls up and becomes caught in the grit of the sandpaper. As that builds, it can actually rip your finish. So it's important. So I'm going to use some 400 grit sandpaper. I'm going to back it up with my sanding block. And I'm going to lightly and carefully start to sand my finish. Now I can feel this is getting pretty sticky. So I may have to add some soap to the mixture. And as I do this, again, I want to find a spot where I can work in good light and I can see what's happening with the finish. So yes, as you can see, this is getting pretty sticky, so I will add a little bit of soap to my water. So let's try this with a little bit of soap added. Oh yes, I can tell a difference immediately. Sands much, much smoother. Now as you sand and the slurry builds, it will become stickier and stickier. So I'll sand a little bit and then I'll come and I will wipe away some of the slurry. I'm going to check to see how it looks. It's looking pretty good. I'm being careful with this because I'm a little light on finish near the center of the sample here. And I know that because after all of the sanding I've been doing thus far, I know where my high spots and my low spots are. Do this a little bit more, wipe it dry, and check my progress. A dry rag. Wipe the slurry off. I'll let it dry and evaluate. So as you can see, it's looking pretty flat. You can notice some shiny spots here. So that's low spots where my sandpaper didn't reach. So I'll go back again with the 400 and sand all of this till a nice even dull sheen. Looks like I removed the majority of the brush strokes already. So now it's just some of those low spots where the sandpaper hasn't reached yet. So a note of caution, when you get the surface wetted, it is really difficult to see those shiny low spots. So you have to be very careful, sand a little bit, covering the entire piece, dry, and check for those low spots to see whether or not they've been removed. I'm pretty happy with the way this looks now. Flat, and I don't see any more of those shiny low spots. It's a little bit right on this edge. See that shiny? That's low, but this is a sample board, I'm not going to worry about that. Though when I hit it with my synthetic abrasive pad, that will most likely disappear. It'll still be low slightly, but it won't have that sheen anymore, that gloss anymore. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take synthetic pad. This is equivalent to a 4/0 steel wool. Steel wool would work fine for this. In my sanding with the 400 grit, just out of habit, I keep my strokes, my motions, my sanding motions going in one direction. So with this pad, I'm going to give tiny little swirl marks that will give an overall satin finish. And you want light, consistent pressure while looking at the piece and raking light. And that should do it. All right. Flat. If I had any low spots, they would appear as little shiny marks, streaks. Brush marks are gone. All the pinholes are gone. And I have a nice satin finish. Now, add a little soap and water for lubrication. Here I have 600 grit wet dry sandpaper. And I am going to go in one direction. I'm going in one direction because I want to see that all of those abrasive marks from the pad have been removed, so I won't see slight swirl marks. I should see nice, even, small scratches from the 600 grit sandpaper. The finer sandpaper you go, the stickier this will be. So wipe often and lubricate. I think you're done. Look carefully. Make sure the previous grit scratches are removed. You can see I still have a few scratches remaining from the 600 grit. So I'll hit this just a touch more. I've just finished up with 1500 grit. You can buy relatively easily grits up to 2500 plus, but I think that finishing at 1500, especially on a small project like this, is enough sanding, and after this I will start to hit it with polishing compound. So the theory is the more grits you do sanding, the less work you have to do with the polishing compound. Though, again, something this size, you'll be fine with just going to 1500. But if you want to go higher with your sanding, go right ahead. On to polishing. There are a lot of polishing products out there. In fact, if you look in our brown cabinet out at school, you'll see we've got so many choices, it's confusing. If you're a professional auto body person, you may really be interested in all that is out there. But I found that you don't necessarily need to go through 6-7 steps in order to get a good polish. I found that these two products by Turtle Wax, one removes medium scratches and the other removes light scratches and also finishes to a high gloss. These two products are fine. If you'd like to try more different products, feel free to do so. So I've got a small applicator rag, and then I have a that I'll use to rub the finish in. I have a little larger towel handy to wipe. So idea is to keep the surface wet. Here I'll use swirling motion. It's easier to keep track of where I've gone. Keep the product wet. Even little circles. Not applying too much pressure. Again, like everything, it's just a matter of trying it out and seeing what works best for you. That should be enough. Okay, I want to wipe this before it dries. So I'll take a clean cloth, fresh clean cloth, and I'll remove the product. I'll buff lightly. Turning often. Again, I'm not using too much pressure. I want to be consistent. And you'll feel the cloth start to glide on the surface. And that's when you know you're good. So this is where we are thus far. See the palm trees in the reflection. I will go to the next grit of polish. We'll see how we can prove upon this reflection. It's important not to use the cloths you just used in the last process, because there's still going to be grit that is coarser than the next compound we're going to put on. So just make sure you start with a fresh applicator. I'm applying a little bit more pressure now than in the last one. Try to get even, consistent swirl marks. Overlapping, just like if you were in the spray booth. That should be good. Fresh wipe off cloth. I want to wipe off all of my excess. A clean buffing rag. How about those palm trees now? There we have it. Depth and shine.